Hey, let's talk to two MPs now. Shadow Environment Secretary, Labour MP Luke Pollard, who is in Plymouth, and Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, who is in London. Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Ellwood, first of all, what do you think of what the Prime Minister's just said?
Well, firstly, can I just say it's a delight to see him back. He's by far the government's best communicator. He's the one that introduced the lockdown. He'll be pleased at how disciplined the nation has been in helping impede the spread of this virus and how we've all come together under that united and common goal. But he also articulated there that the reality is until we procure a vaccine, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. So until then, the government must clearly illuminate every step of the way. And that means continuing the mission to defeat COVID-19, but also allowing the economy to slowly open up. But there he made it very, very clear. There's a collective resolve that we need to continue. He's sympathetic to the pressures of the lockdown, but we are not out of the woods. Good work has been done. We mustn't allow that to be undone. But I'm pleased to hear that there'll be more to come in the next few days about exactly how we move into phase two. The nation has been very disciplined, very educated. We are ready to continue that discipline and education, but the next phase will be more complicated. We need to learn what the new rules will be.
Mr. Pollard, for Labour, what do you think of what the Prime Minister's told the nation this morning?
Well, I think all of us are glad that he's back at work. But what we now need to see is the publication of a clear exit strategy. Scotland, Wales, other European countries have done exactly that. And I think the warm words that he gave to the nation to lift our spirits at a time of crisis now needs to be matched with the detail about which sectors go back first, which businesses can start preparing, how do they introduce social distancing measures in businesses that are currently closed. It's that type of information that Labour's been calling for in the publication of an exit strategy so people can start preparing and understanding about what happens next.
Well, he did
because
say,
if they have that type of information...
He did say that the decisions now that are going to be made over the following days and weeks, he will do the maximum possible transparency. He said he would reach out to build consensus across party lines.
And I hope that is the case. I mean, what we have been calling for is the publication of an exit strategy that sets out that transparent process ahead. And if this is a sign that he's been listening to those calls, I think that is welcome, because all of us want to see a clear path ahead. Because if we don't have that clear path ahead, my fear is that the lockdown will begin to wither at the edges, as we've seen in the last few days. The vast majority of Britons have been abiding by the guidelines, have been staying at home and protecting lives. But if we don't have that clear sense of where the direction of the country is, I fear that others will choose to just make an exception for themselves. And that's a type of activity that could lead to the second peak that the Prime Minister spoke about. So a clear exit strategy, collectively put together with cross-party support, I think is something that the whole nation can get behind.
Right. Mr. Ellwood, do you agree with that the public should now be included in conversations about the trade-offs, about the competing risks? And the Prime Minister should just be straight with us.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has been made very clear now that absolutely there will be transparency and inclusion of views. But if I can correct Luke, who I have a lot of time and respect for, the exit comes with a vaccine. There is no exit strategy from this. Restrictions will have to stay in place for many, many months. What we need to look at is how can we learn to live with COVID-19 whilst making sure that we don't see a second spike, but parts of our economy can come back to work. I don't think it's right the government slides across and says, this and that can actually happen. What it needs to do is set out what are the restrictions for any business wanting to open up. The business themselves then proves to government or even to an environmental health officer on a local level to say, I meet these new parameters, I can open up, it'll be safe for employees, it'll also be safe for customers as well. That would be a logical cognitive way to go around this, rather than just having a long list of things that can or cannot open up.
OK. There are, of course, many other consequences to continued lockdown, Luke Pollard. Today, highlighted again by Refuge, they tell us that the number of calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the first 3 weeks of lockdown has gone up by almost 50%. 50% increase in calls to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. That is really alarming, isn't it?
It certainly is. There are far too many people that are the victims of domestic abuse before the virus, but because there's so many more people in their homes in lockdown, that we're seeing the increase of the incidence of domestic violence really surge. That's why Nick Thomas-Symonds, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary, has called on the government to really ramp up and publish a strategy that addresses that, making sure that not only the helplines have the additional funding that has been announced, but that additional funding is also passed through to the refuges, to the frontline services that are supporting those people who are fleeing domestic abuse. But the message needs to go out loud and clear here that if you are being subject to domestic abuse, you are not alone. You do not have to stay in that home with your family to be victims of that abuse. There is help available, and we need to make sure that help is properly funded, especially at a time when we're seeing those calls for help, which sadly will only be a small fraction of the number of people who are suffering domestic abuse. We need to make sure the resources are put in to help every single one of those people and their families to flee, to escape from that domestic abuse, to make sure that they get to a place of safety. And people need to know that they're not alone in those circumstances.
Mr. Elwood, we found out at the weekend that nearly 21,000 people have died in UK hospitals in this country with coronavirus. Of course, it will be much, much higher than that when we take into account those who've died in care homes and in their own home. Why so many in this country?
Sorry, are you referring to the care homes themselves or overall?
No, I'm referring to the number of people who've died from coronavirus in this country. Why is it so high?
Well, this is something that we will look back on. I don't agree with some of the numbers that we're seeing in other countries. Germany, for example.
No, I just want to talk about our country and the reasons why you think the numbers are so high.
But they're high in comparison with other countries. That's what you're suggesting here. What we're seeing is a virus that spread that people compared initially with flu. They thought the contagion rate would be similar to flu epidemics. And the speed in which it came across, not just Asia, but Europe as well, has taken everybody by surprise. Our numbers will be very similar at the end of the day, I think, to other countries in Europe of similar sizes. I make the point, though, that Germany, which is used as a benchmark to say, look how they're doing it, they don't report all coronavirus deaths the same way that we do. That's not a dig at Germany, but that's a dig actually at the World Health Organization that hasn't produced a standard way to report coronavirus deaths.
But do you acknowledge that the guidance back in early March in this country was wrong?
No, there'll be plenty of time to look back at the decisions that were made and the points that were made. What we can say is that thanks to the efforts of this government, our NHS has not been overwhelmed. If you or I were sick, we would be able to find a bed or be given a bed, an ICU bed, most importantly, to attempt to keep us alive. If there is a question now for immediate for the Prime Minister to look at, it's the fact that the Nightingale programme has been hugely successful, but they're underutilised. I would like to see the pressure taken off general hospitals to return back to their normal business of saving lives in non-coronavirus related illnesses, and then the Nightingale programmes hogging the wicket, if you like, taking over more and more of the COVID-19 illnesses, allowing our hospitals to return back to normal.
Yeah, that is interesting because the head of the Birmingham Nightingale says they haven't treated one patient. Luke Pollard, would that be an idea?
I think it's certainly an issue and a suggestion worth considering. I mean, the key thing here is we need to make sure that the priority is given to people with coronavirus symptoms that need that extra care. But there will be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are waiting for other operations and for other types of medical care that they would otherwise be getting in hospital settings at the moment. So having a plan as to how we can address that huge backlog that is building up, it needs to be part of that wider exit strategy, that wider plan that sets in train how things will happen in the future. But it's important that we don't overlook what's happening in our care homes, because my fear about where we are at the moment is that we were too slow into lockdown. We've been too slow into providing our frontline with the PPE and the testing it needs. And I fear we'll be too slow into recognising just what an impact coronavirus is having in our care homes around the country, for whom we have some of our most vulnerable people. So there is that comprehensive approach that is needed, and transparency, as the Prime Minister has laid out, will be the best way of understanding that. But swift action that we know needs to be taken needs to be part of that recipe as well. And that's why I hope that in the now the Prime Minister's back at his desk, as he describes it, the exit strategy, publishing those first steps that he outlined in the vague terms in his remarks, needs to be his top priority, because we all need to know what our part is in the wider national effort. Okay. Staying at home has been an important part of that, but there's additional steps that we need to take to help our economy remain resilient, help people's livelihoods be protected, and slow the spread of the virus. And that is what I think the priority should be for government.
Thank you both very much. Thank you. Luke Pollard, Shadow Environment Secretary. Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee.